How are you getting on? My name is Moroney, and I have been a demand generation marketer for more than a decade in the B2B SaaS space. And more recently, I am the co-founder of a demand generation agency. And I'm hoping to talk to you for the next few minutes on, you probably guessed it, but demand generation, but particularly through the lens of event marketing. And a little bit of context. In my career, I have worked very closely with event marketers. A lot of my role was driving RSVPs to large summit events. So you have all my empathy on the difficulty of the challenge of getting people to events. But I want to talk about some of the things that I've come to learn about demand gen that will hopefully help you in that effort. Before we go any further, it is worth touching on, if you've never seen any of my content, why am I coming to you from the middle of a woods in the windy New York suburbs? Well, the answer is think of it as a heavy-handed metaphor for standing out in things that you're doing in marketing. Hopefully this looks a little bit different to what you're going to be watching today, so maybe it'll be a bit more memorable as a result. But you could also think of it as it's really nature and I wanted to be outside in it, and that was my excuse. But anyway, back to demand generation. What I wanted to talk about was demand generation through two different lenses. The first is a lot of the misunderstood thinking about demand generation, particularly when it comes to high value conversions like an RSVP to a big event. And then I also want to talk a little bit about what exactly demand looks like in reality. What does it mean to have demand for something and what generates that? So the first is just the thinking that has been incorrect. There's a lot of legacy thinking in demand gen that is still very much around, and it's how I was trained, where it is thought of as a lead generation effort, a lead acquisition effort, or a conversion effort. It is about trying to drive people to do things, in this case, signing up to attend an event. And one of the problems with that is that it skips the really important first step, which is, do you have enough awareness and have you positioned yourself correctly to convince people to convert? And the truth is that most old school demand generation thinking does not. It tries to do as much conversion as it can in the moment that you're putting things in front of people. So let's say you're doing promotion for an event and you want to go after cold audiences, people who you do not know, who are not part of your database, who are not in your circle, which I'm going to guess is probably a lot of what the strategy you're focused on is. One of the ways you can do that is by putting together ads, driving people to registration pages, landing pages, where you've got a bit of information about who's speaking, who's attending, things like that. And they can work, but there's two really important things that I want to talk about, because an event registration is kind of in the same realm as a demo request. It's a very high commitment ask, and that comes along with two big implications. One is that it's very difficult to get somebody cold who you just stop in the middle of a feed or in their inbox or wherever it might be and say, I'd like you to come to our event. How about it? So what you end up happening is the conversion rates are generally a lot lower than you'd like them to be, and the cost for those conversions are a lot higher than you can probably justify. Demo request cold ads can be in the thousands of dollars per conversion. Same goes for event registrations, because it's a very high commitment ask. But there's another side of it too, which is the quality of it diminishes quite significantly when you go that route. So if you get someone to attend an event or register for an event and they were in your database, they were part of your email list, there are people who are familiar with your content, those people will likely show up at the drop-off rates that you typically see. Maybe it's 30%, 40%, whatever that is. When you go down the route of people who are cold that you're getting through advertising, those rates plummet. They can be half that, they can be less than half that. And the reason is because it's a big ask to ask a stranger. And so the few that you do convince to fill out the form generally aren't really bought in on the idea, so they're less likely to actually go through with it when the time comes. And that brings me to the second part of it, which is what exactly generates demand. And this is where there is a lot of failed new thinking on demand gen, where you might have heard terms like demand creation coming around, where it's about win people over, build fans, create demand for things, whether it's a product, whether it's an event. And when I went to college, I did a marketing degree. The first thing they told us was marketers are not able to create needs in people. It is just fundamentally not an ability we have, because needs exist in people inherently. Our job is to show that we're the best solution to that need. And that applies very directly to demand generation, Because you might think an event doesn't fall into the same category, where you may not need to go to an event, therefore you are creating demand to go to it. And sure, we can get into the nuance of that, but the truth is that when you're looking at the messaging and the positioning that you put forward, a lot of marketers go down the path of be impressive, be big, talk about all the accolades, the guests, the speakers, etc., which is not a bad strategy, but it misses the boat because it's not looking for the demand that exists. It's not looking for the pain that it solves. And often things like events are not solving pains of desire. I want to see that keynote speaker. Maybe they are, and if you've got a really great keynote speaker, good for you. You'll probably succeed possibly off that alone. But more often than not, you're trying to succeed off the quality of the event and not a whale that's going to be on stage. And when that's the case, often the messaging comes back to, well, what pains does it solve? And when it comes to things like events, it's usually one of two. It is either there is education you're going to provide people that gives them the ability to solve a problem they have today. Maybe you're in a particular space, maybe you're educating on how to do it better. Tapping into this will make you better at your job. This will solve the problems you have today. This event is going to have critical knowledge that you will not get elsewhere and will give you an advantage. That is something you can build demand off of. And the other part of it is probably realistically FOMO. It is networking. All of your peers are going to be there. All of these people, these companies are going to be there. That does generate quite a lot of FOMO. So I've given you a lot of academic theory. Hopefully it's not completely nonsensical, but I want to turn it into something that's a little bit actionable. What can you do with this information? The things that work really well, particularly back to this first point about the lead generation cold audience, is to not go down the cold audience path where possible. What has become very effective for me and for clients that I work with is retargeting. Use one layer of advertising to drive people towards a page that gives them education. Mostly education, not an attempt to try and squeeze them into a registration, because it's generally too high of an ask on a first try. And try and do that as cost effectively as possible. Maybe LinkedIn is the channel, maybe Facebook, maybe Instagram, maybe content syndication, whatever you might be using, and build a retargeting list of people who have gone to that page and have at least digested that information, and then follow up in quick enough succession with more advertising days later saying, okay, now's your time to register. The retargeting is where the conversions tend to happen. And from a messaging point of view, try and identify as much as possible what you solve by getting them to come to that event, what in their world improves what will be the thing they have demand to solve, and position yourself and your messaging as the solution to that. Those two things I have found to be some of the most valuable and impactful things to drive registrants to something high value. I hope that was helpful. And if there's any questions, find me on LinkedIn. I would love to have a conversation. But enjoy the rest of your event.